Welcome, everyone. Over the last 2 months, we've been reading and discussing Adam Gehen's book, Everyday Habits for Transforming Systems. And today we have an opportunity to meet with Adam. A couple of weeks ago, we came together to produce a collective narrative with our reflections on the book and questions about Adam's work. And today we'll start with Adam responding to this collective narrative. After that, we'll have Q&A and closing remarks from Adam. Feel free to use the chat throughout the session. During the Q&A part, we will look for your questions in the chat and call on you one by one to ask your questions. Thank you so much, Adam, for being with us today. We'll hear from you in a moment. And in the meantime, my colleague Dmitry will introduce today's flow in Russian.
Всем добрый день, добрый вечер. И очень рад всех видеть. Последние 3 месяца мы с вами читали и обсуждали книгу Адама Кахейна «Повседневные привычки для преобразования систем». И сегодня у нас есть возможность встретиться с самим автором. И пару недель назад, как вы помните, мы собирались вместе для того, чтобы создать коллективный нарратив, куда включили наши размышления о книге и вопросы к Адаму, к его работе. Сегодня начнем с того, что Адам откликнется на этот нарратив. После этого будет сессия вопросов и ответов, и затем заключительные слова. Спасибо Адаму за то, что он сегодня с нами. Спасибо всем, кто подошел. Добрый путь.
Спасибо. Thank you very much. I'm really grateful to Fyodor and Dmitry for organizing this. When you write a book, you want people to read it and take it seriously. So I'm grateful and very interested in this conversation. I read the narrative through several times and have some notes on it. I'll respond to the narrative. I don't know how long it will take. And I'm interested in the conversation because you raise some fundamental issues, which I think are very important, but that I don't know the answers to. So I would like to discuss them. So Fyodor sent me the narrative, I guess, a week ago, but he also explained to me that I needed to understand the Russian approach to giving feedback on text like this. I think he was worried that I would be discouraged or depressed at the critical questions. So that was helpful in calibrating or in interpreting your comments. And it happens by coincidence that yesterday I had a similar book discussion with a group of people from Los Angeles. So I feel like I'm getting the two extremes, at least on that dimension, this week in the discussion of this book. And also, there's many references to the American format, and I must, of course, give the protest that I am Canadian, not American. You may not see the difference. I do remember there used to be an institute in Moscow for US and Canadian studies, but in Canada, this distinction is quite important. Okay, I'm going to respond in the order of the narrative. And I think the most important point is made in the first paragraph about what is universal and what is particular or subjective or cultural. And I think it's an important question. I'd like to discuss it. I don't know what the applicability or relevance or utility of this book is in your context, but I will give you a general answer to that question, which is the one given to me by a French colleague many years ago when we were discussing this matter. And he said to me, it's like the Paris fashion show. Every year it's different, and every year it's the same. So both statements are true simultaneously, that of course every situation is particular. I'm sure you know the line about, I think Tolstoy's line about every unhappy family is unhappy in its own way. So every situation is particular, and every situation is the same. So that really is my answer to your question. They're both true. Because I'm an abstract thinker, my training was in mathematical physics, I tend to be interested in abstract universal theories. And when I thought about your questions, I thought about your question for a while, and I realized that my assertion or my hypothesis is that every word in this book is applicable in every context. So just to be very dramatic about it, And I will explain that later, but I think that these 7 habits are applicable in all contexts, all social contexts, all human contexts. Of course, subject to particular constraints and affordances. And here I'm using the words, the English words used by David Snowden and Chris Corrigan, who at least Fyodor is familiar with. And I think I mention it in the book, that every system has affordances, things it allows us to do, constraints, things that we can't do. And so within the given system's constraints and affordances, I believe, or my assertion is, my hypothesis is, that these 7 habits are applicable. So the Zoom platform we're using has certain affordances. It enables us to do certain things. We can talk here across distance, across language. It's really quite extraordinary. This wasn't possible 10 years ago. And it has constraints. I can't get closer to Fyodor's, what's on the wall behind Fyodor, and lean into the frame and see what's written. I can't look around the town that Dimitri is living in that I've never been to before. So every system has constraints and affordances, of course, but I'm arguing that the 7 habits are applicable nonetheless. As I said, I've read your narrative several times, and in reading it for the 3rd time, you asked the question about universality and particularity, which I've given my answer to, the Paris Fashion Show answer, but you use a different word. You talk about subjective experience. I mean, these are related, I guess, but they strike me as slightly different questions. And I remembered and found last night a quote from a long time ago. As I said, my training is in physics, theoretical physics, and systems thinking. The last time I had substantial interaction with Russian colleagues, other than the one Zoom call that Dmitry organized a few years ago, was in the late 1980s, when I was a junior researcher at the International Institute for Applied Systems Analysis in Vienna. I don't know what it is now, but at the time it was an East-West research center. So my training is very mathematical. And so when I started doing this work on social systems, I didn't know anything about the theoretical background. I'll come back to that point in a minute. But I remember one of the very first books I read was a book called Discovering Common Ground by Marvin Weisbord. It's quite a well-known book, old book in this field of multi-stakeholder collaboration. It's the first book I ever found in this field. And he quotes in it somebody who I think is a well-known social psychologist, who did experimental work on consensus, I think in the 1950s. And I found last night the quote that influenced me so much when I read it. As I said, this was the first book I ever read on the work I had started to do. And Solomon Asch, the social psychologist, said, "Consensus is valid only to the extent to which each individual asserts his own relationship to the facts and retains his individuality. There can be no genuine agreement unless each adheres to the testimony of his experience and steadfastly maintains his hold on reality." So I hadn't thought about that quote in decades, but it was triggered by your use. Of course, I'm reading from the English, where you said, should I learn the universal language of Adam's habits, or should I use the book to make sense of my own subjective experience? And I would answer, my considered answer is both. I'm offering what I believe to be universal principles, and as Solomon Asch advises, you have to make sense of this in terms of your own experience. I'm not asking you to accept something. I would think it would be illegitimate, even manipulative or dictatorial, to ask you to accept something that doesn't make sense to you. Okay, That's the first paragraph. I'm not going to spend so long on every paragraph, but that's the first paragraph. In the second paragraph, you talk about the criteria of systems to which these habits can be applied. And I didn't say this in the book because I hadn't thought about it, but your narrative causes me to clarify that my hypothesis is I believe that all 7 of these habits are applicable in any social system, but with taking account of its affordances and constraints. So, to take the 2 examples you give, experimenting a way forward. I say this in the book. I have experimented a lot. I've made many mistakes. This language may or may not be familiar to you, but many people have criticized my emphasis on experimentation by saying that I'm speaking from a point of view of privilege, being a gray-bearded white male Canadian with a good income, and that many people cannot afford to experiment the way I have and cannot afford to fail the way I have and would have much harsher professional or financial or violent repercussions for trying things out that don't work. But nonetheless, my assertion is that experimenting a way forward is still required, but of course, in the circumstances you have. I mean, I'm looking out the window. I'm in my apartment on the 2nd floor. I have a balcony outside my window. I could experiment with jumping off the balcony and see if I could fly, but that would really be very unwise. If, on the other hand, I had a parachute or a rope or something, this would be a different system and it would be a safer thing to do. So I'm asserting that experimenting a way forward is still required, but I'm, of course, being prudent. I think I described in the book or in one of my books my work in Ethiopia. I worked in Ethiopia, I guess, about 6 or 7 years ago. It's under the current government, which at the time was liberalizing, but the period of the dictatorship had just ended. And we had a meeting. I got to Addis Ababa. I had never been there before. I was going to meet with my local colleagues who I'd never met in person. And we walked from my hotel and we walked to another hotel. And then we walked through the lobby of that hotel into a park. And I asked, why are we meeting in the park? And they said, no, we have our meetings in the park because we are safe from audio surveillance here, whereas we would be worried. So they were experimenting. They were doing something that had never been done in Ethiopia, the particular process we were running. I suppose there was some danger, but they were doing it in a way that fit within the constraints of their environment. Similarly, collaborating with unlike others, which is the other example you give in that paragraph, this point is very clear to me because, as Fyodor and Dmitry know, I have just spent the past 12 months rewriting entirely a different book, which is the book Collaborating with the Enemy, which the first, as I guess some of you know, the first edition was translated into Russian. I hope the second one will be as well. And so collaborating with unlike others, chapters, habit 6, the double click on that is the book Collaborating with the Enemy. I'm very happy to have been able to rewrite it almost completely. And I've been able to clarify many things. And one thing very important is that I am not recommending that everybody collaborate with everybody on everything. In fact, of course, it's completely impossible. It's logistically impossible. You collaborate with some people on some things, sometimes for some reasons. And so when I say that habit 6, collaborating with unlike others, is a universal habit, yes, but who you need to collaborate with, who you can collaborate with, who you think it's safe to collaborate with and unsafe to collaborate with, even the word collaboration. I rewrote the book in part in Paris. I had a fellowship at a research institute there. And in Paris, to use the word collaboration is absolutely forbidden. People said, you can't use that word here because, as you may know, in France in particular, the word collaboration has a very strong connotation of collaborating with the Nazis during the Second World War. The word is used primarily in that context. By the way, and this is my one Russian joke, I gave a talk about this, my book writing project at this institute. It's called the Paris Institute for Advanced Study, which very nice people from all across, well, primarily Europe, but elsewhere. So I gave a talk about my book and I got extremely helpful feedback from many people. And I was sitting at lunch after my talk, the main activity of this Paris Institute was having lunch together. They seemed to spend 50% of their budget on their lunches. That was the big attraction. And it happens, a Russian person who was there. His name is Pavel Lurie. I guess you wouldn't know him. He's an archaeologist. He knows some Iranic language. I said, how many people know that language in the world? He said 2. Anyhow, a true scholar, sort of people I don't meet very often. And I turned to him at lunch and I said, what's the Russian view of collaboration? And he said, pragmatic, which I thought was an extremely good answer. And I quoted him on this in the second edition of the book. So yes, I'm arguing that collaborating with unlike others, in other words, collaborating across difference with people who have different positions or perspectives, as Pavel said, we have to be pragmatic. Okay. So in conclusion, from your first section, my hypothesis is that all 7 of these habits are valuable and, in fact, necessary for peaceful social change in all social contexts. And I'm very interested in your perspective. You say several times, how does this relate to local conditions, local culture, the Russian context? I would say I have no idea, but I'm very interested in. I think in the book I quote Fyodor made a comment on that, but I'm really interested in hearing what you think. Okay, that's my major point, but I have a few other points, so I'll take another 10 minutes. You refer, again, I'm reading from the English translation, to the self-help genre in describing the book. Now, you may or may not know that, but in English, self-help genre is really an insult. Well, it's really an insult. So I had to calm myself down from this very terrible insult. I'll assume it was just a translation problem and not I mean, there are real self-help books, but I think it's not fair, that translation, or it's not a fair characterization of the book. It is a book about individual actions, but individual actions not to help yourself, but to help the system. So I'm disputing the characterization. And yet, of course, the basic question the book asks, which I guess is obvious, is all system transformation is a collective activity with very few exceptions. Maybe some very unusual or very small circumstances can be changed by a single person. But for example, if I take the very dramatic changes being implemented by the Trump administration, which are well known to you, but I think maybe even more felt by those of us very close to the border. I'm within 1 hour drive of the border. Even that, I think it's described as the Trump transformation or the changes affected by Trump. But I think this is a really lazy shorthand. There's thousands of people involved and have been working for decades. And he is obviously a player, a major player, but it would not be correct, in my opinion, to say that this is a work of one person. It'd be a very serious misunderstanding, a dangerous misunderstanding. And so, obviously, almost all transformation of social systems, especially large social systems, is a collective undertaking. That's to say, an undertaking that involves many people. But the question still arises, what do each of those people need to do on an everyday basis, not once every 4 years when they vote, once every year in a strategy workshop, but on a day-to-day basis. And that's the subject of the book. So it's not a self-help book, but it is a book about individual action for collective change. It's, in that sense, of all my books, the most retail. That's to say, the target readership is the individual person. And much later on, you say, is this book applicable to ordinary persons? Well, I've tried to write it in a way that is applicable to ordinary persons, and I'll come back to that in my final comment. So you ask me the question, how would I articulate certain points that would be specifically relevant to a Russian-speaking group from the post-Soviet space? I'm not in the habit of giving people advice about their situation, but I'm really interested in that question. And I think more generally, in many parts of the world, including, I would say, the United States, how to do the work of transforming systems in an authoritarian context is, I think, a key question of our time. You ask in passing how to talk with different groups of people involved in studying this work. As Fyodor and maybe others of you know, I've run several global discussion groups. They've been interesting, at least to me. I'm going to run another one in the middle of October. You're welcome to join, as I think some of you did last time. If you want people to join you in a Russian speaking, if you make the invitation, I'm happy to use my platforms to circulate it. Now, there's a point in the section which is entitled The Ethics of Power and the Limits of Tolerance. So here's something I have a very particular point of view on. I've been working on it for years. And this is this concept of power, love, and justice. And these words are difficult in English, probably in Russian as well, because they have many connotations, but nonetheless, they're very evocative. And I've been trying to work it out in a very peculiar way, I would say a mathematical way. I had a very exciting meeting in Dubai in November, where I found some engineers who were willing to sit with me for an hour and talk about the mathematics of power, love, and justice. It was a thrilling encounter. So I've thought a lot about this, and I define power following a certain author, his name's Paul Tillich, as the drive of everything living to realize itself with increasing intensity and extensity. So it's a universal drive. It's a book about ontology, how things are. So this author, Tillich, asserts that all living things have the drive of power. So the answer I would give, or the way I would answer your question, you say, who and in what situations should exercise power? So I'm going to give you maybe a peculiar answer, but my point of view is everybody exercises power. In fact, it's literally true that nothing happens without power. So the choice about should we exercise power, to me, is a nonsensical question. It's equivalent to asking, should we inhale? Now, of course, we have different ambitions, different capacities, different authorities, legal, illegal, number of followers, amount of money, number of guns, position in the system, et cetera, et cetera. So I'm not saying everybody has the same kind of power, but the idea, in my way of thinking about it and writing about it, and I cover this in passing in the book that you've read, and I've made yet another effort to unpack this in the new version of Collaborating with the Enemy. I'm quite happy with my most recent exposition. Everybody has to work with power, the drive for self-realization, to do what we're trying to do, and love, which is the sense of the being part of larger wholes, and justice, which has to do with the relationships amongst the wholes. So that's my mathematical explanation. Okay, in the end of that section, you refer to me describing habit 6, collaborating with unlike others, collaborating across difference, as being difficult, and that I also find it difficult. And it's a good question. The introduction to the new edition of Collaborating with the Enemy is entitled Collaboration is Becoming Increasingly Important and Increasingly Difficult. I had a very shocking workshop 2 years ago in Thailand with senior Chinese and US officials where they concluded that the only scenarios were scenarios of decreasing collaboration. And they were basically bad, badder, baddest, and thermonuclear war. So I think we're living in a context where collaboration is becoming increasingly important because of shared risks, climate change, AI, etc., and increasingly difficult internationally, nationally, for reasons that many people have written about. But also, I personally find it very difficult. I have a close friend who I quoted in the final chapter of the book you've read, Michael Galopter. He's a post-university friend. We talk all the time. I consider him very smart in ways I'm not about human experiences. He's a real academic at Yale. And I was asked him, why is this so difficult? And his answer was as short as Pavel's answer. Michael said to me, people. So I just think there's an irreducible difficulty in dealing with people, that we have different experiences and positions and perspectives. We always have differences and disagreements and discomfort. I personally am too sensitive. And so I, like many people, faced with such absolutely ordinary difficulties and disagreements and discomforts, my tendency is to try to work apart from or around or against. So I'm not saying everybody is as feeble as I am, but I do think that collaborating across difference is something that most people find very difficult. In fact, I was thinking this week about some company CEOs that I've met who I've experienced to be very brutal or very, not sensitive at all. In some book, I refer to a Unilever executive I worked with at some time named Tex Gunning, a very tough Dutchman. But I was thinking this week, they had a capacity to do difficult things and to risk people being upset with them that I don't have and that I admire. So, okay. You ask that the book is written at active participants who are already engaged in system transformation. How can we extend this work to other groups? I don't know the answer, but I guess the one word answer, I'm specializing today following your countryman Pavel in one word answers. I guess the word is leadership. So you lead other people to do something and you try to find a way to make this something that seems important to you or obvious to you, to make it important and obvious to other people. Now, the last two sections, you ask about the book Scientific Foundations. So I am not an academic. This experience in Paris was fun for me just because I haven't been in a research institute actually since IASA, that East-West Institute where I was when I was still a student. When I wrote my first book, Solving Tough Problems, I asked Peter Senge, who's at MIT, to write the foreword, and he commented that my book didn't have very many footnotes. That's to say, references to the literature, and I started to apologize. And he said, no, it wasn't a criticism. Some people learn from books and other people learn in other ways. So for better or worse, I learn primarily from reflecting on my own experience. So that's, I think, the strength and the limitation of this book, of my other books. In 2022, I won an award at Davos, a Thought Leader Award, and there were three of us who won the award that year, and the other two were university professors. And I was standing behind those other two in a lunch line, and they didn't realize I was behind them, and they were talking about me and about my books. And they said it in a very nice way. One of them said, his books are really quite good, but he doesn't seem to know anything at all about the literature. Does he really think that he can reinvent all of social science simply by reflecting on his own personal experience? So they weren't being mean. They thought it was just a very odd thing to try to do. But yes, the answer is yes. That's what Adam thinks he can do. I think I can develop useful hypotheses by reflecting on my own first and second-hand experiences. I have a brother who's a professor of political science. And when I wrote my first book, I said, I'm writing about collaboration. I need to put a lot of footnotes in. Can you please give me some footnotes that I can put in? And this is my younger brother. And he said, Adam, just forget it. That's a really stupid thing to do. Just write from your own experience and don't put in footnotes just to try to pretend that you know the literature when you obviously don't. So the answer is, you said, we would like to locate his book on the map of sociological concepts. Sounds like a great idea. I have no idea. I don't know how. Okay, the very last section, the boundaries of his engagement with processes, what happens when he leaves abruptly. I think this is the limitations of the consulting model. I have worked primarily as a consultant. There's certain benefits to that if you're interested in discussing it, but there's also great limitations. And so I've often helped for a while, and then people either carry on without me or the project doesn't continue. And that's the limitation of the work I've done. I have no idea about AI. I'd love to hear your views on it. And then the very final point, you asked me, how do I see this book now? And what do I see as the continuation of the work? As you know, this book was published in April, but that means that the manuscript was finished in August 2024. And in my view, the world has changed a lot since August 2024. And when the book was published in April 2025, I started having many conversations about it online like this one. And also in April, May, and June, I gave a lot of in-person talks, mostly in Europe, but also in Canada and South Africa. And this was my main question. How does the 2024 text work in the 2025 context? So I thought a lot about this question, and I wrote a paper on it. I had a second month in Paris at the same institute, and the paper I wrote, which will be published in their academic journal in a few weeks, I'll send you the link when it comes out, is exactly on this question. How does the 2024 text work in the 2025 context? And I'll just read you as my final statement, the three conclusions I reached, because I looked at the paper again last night. So I would say, I think the book is fine. It's not, I feared in April, maybe the whole book's obsolete. I don't think it is at all, but I think there's three clarifications I would make. The first is, if we had had this conversation 10 years ago, maybe not with you, but if I had discussed these matters 10 years ago, people would say to me, I don't understand what a system is. I don't understand how you can transform systems. I don't think anybody asks that question anymore. I think between climate and trade and political change, it's quite obvious to everybody, I'm sure to all of you, that there are systems, they provide constraints and affordances, and although the implication of the book is these change slowly and with great difficulty, there's also the great gift of 2025 is it shows us that transformation can actually occur very quickly. And so in a way, the existence proof has been made. And the way I would amplify on the main metaphor in the book about cracks is systems are always cracking. Those cracks can be used to advance transformation. That's the point of view in the book, but they can also be used to resist transformation. Another way of saying this is that the central metaphor in the book is that we imagine systems to be stable and solid and smooth, and so we have to look very closely for cracks to change them. Somebody said to me, well, the current context is the opposite. It's not that the systems are stable and smooth, like a rock face. We're in the middle of an avalanche. The question is not how to create cracks, but how to find any stable point amidst the avalanche. The second thing I want to clarify is that working with enacting the opportunities for change requires employing power, both to collaborate and to force. And I've written a lot about the interplay between forcing and collaborating. And then finally, I stand by my assertion that if you want to participate in system transformation non-violently, I think it's possible. We're seeing many demonstrations of transforming systems through bullying and bombing, literally. This is not a book about how to bully or bomb, but I think if you want an alternative to bullying and bombing, that alternative is radical engagement, and which includes positioning ourselves not apart from the system, but as part of the system. So there you go.
Thank you, Adam. When you ask your questions, you can use either English or Russian, and we will translate.
Вопросы можно задавать, соответственно, на любом из языков, как вам удобнее.
Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot, Adam. First of all, I want to say a very big thank you for letting us read your book. And my question is not about theory, it's more about maybe just your vision about your practice. Nowadays, just continue on your last answer, what of all the conflicts in the present nowadays you see the most challenging? Maybe Middle East or Russia, Ukraine, or maybe anything else, what you think is the most important to facilitate, and what is more difficult, or maybe just the most interesting for you as a specialist. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Evgeny. I'm doing less consulting or facilitating than before because of my age and family circumstances, and I spent most of my time writing. But there are two things that I'm interested in, and these are obvious answers. But well, sorry, three. Maybe the first is not obvious. So the obvious one is climate change, which is difficult for reasons that are well known. But I was on a call this morning, and the point of view of the person I was talking to is the ecological logic is in contradiction to the human political logic. The second, which might surprise you, is the situation in Canada. A friend of mine who used to head the Foreign Affairs Department of the Government of Canada made the shocking statement to me a few weeks ago that Canada is the Ukraine of North America. And he was saying that to say that Canadians are much less prepared than Ukrainians to deal with the challenges they face, and this will require an almost unimaginable cultural and political and economic change. So I'm Canadian. I was born here. I'm a citizen. I'm looking for ways to contribute to that. And the third example, again, quite obvious, but when I look both at Ukraine-Russia conflict and especially at the Israel-Palestine conflict, I have more emotional connection to the Israel-Palestine because I'm Jewish, and I have within my family supporters of both sides and very big disagreements within my family, within my social circle. It's a very big, it's as I guess you know, the most difficult political issue in Canada. It's a very large increase both in anti-Jewish and anti-Muslim violence, including in Montreal, the city where I am. And I was reading this morning an analysis of the Israeli bombing in Qatar, and the analysis, it's the purest example, I think, that you can find, at least speaking here of the Israeli position, that the way for us to achieve our objectives is to kill or destroy or frighten our opponents, period. The articulated strategy is that is the strategy. So in a way is the exact opposite of what I'm writing about. And So for those two reasons, I'm paying a lot of attention to it.
Thank you, Adam, for being here with us today. Well, speaking of collaborating with the enemy, contact with the other is very frightening, and people mostly avoid contact not only with the enemy, but also with the other in this existentialist sense. And according to your observation, what is the driving force, or maybe driving forces, that suddenly makes a person who is not ready for dialogue, who has denied any contact with the enemy, turn to him and try to understand?
Thank you. I'm going to give my Russian answer to that, which is pragmatism. I think there's different possible answers, but the answer I've been focused on is we work with people that we don't want to, that we might not agree with or like or trust, because we think that even though it's difficult, it is required to achieve what we're trying to achieve. Now, I want to give a more elaborate answer. When I published the book Collaborating with the Enemy, one of my colleagues named Zaid Hassan, I think probably Fyodor knows him, violently objected to the title. And what he said to me at the time was that when you use the expression enemy, you are risking a crypto-Schmittist interpretation. I had no idea what he meant, but I think he made an extremely important point, which I now realized and which I was able to correct in the second edition. He was referring to Carl Schmitt, who was the Nazi political and legal scholar who wrote about all politics is about friends and enemies. Enemies are the ones you will kill, and friends are the ones you would die for. So I think Zaid was right. And what I elaborate now in the new edition is that the problem is dividing the world into friends and enemies. Friends are the people we can work with, and enemies are the people we can never work with, black and white. And what I argue is what's required instead is to realize that the whole spectrum is gray. People we could work with under certain circumstances. So that is my clarification.
Dear Adam, thank you very much for being with us. And it was really a pleasure to read your book. And during the whole discussion, all the time we stressed that it is very difficult to analyze political system. As for me, I'm a journalist and I'm specializing on political system and mostly in post-Soviet states. And one of the habit to work with scraps, and it is very interesting for me. But when we discuss, for example, political system in Kazakhstan, in Kyrgyzstan, I'm originated from Central Asia region. And for example, if there are some kind of revolution and we see the crack in the wall of the political system, but at the same time, another leader came and he promised to reform the system and he promised to work with these cracks in the wall of the system. But during several years, we analyze that he didn't work with these cracks, but he just imitate that he tried to reform it and to make system better. And if activists or volunteers, if they try to say him that his way is not correct, so he just start to make the system authoritarian and he start to press. So what is your opinion? How to understand at the beginning, maybe, whether the leader want just to imitate that he work with the crabs, or he really want to work with these crabs and make the system better? Thank you.
Yeah, I I don't think I have much to contribute to your understanding, which is better than mine. When you spoke, I realized that this metaphor of cracks, which has really worked well, I'll explain in a little while where I got the first idea, but it's really an interesting metaphor. And what I hadn't realized until I listened to you, of course, is that in the East European Soviet sphere imagery, cracks refers to the Berlin Wall. So Galia, the only comment I would make, again, this is probably obvious, but I think it's important. My understanding is that everybody has an agenda, 100% of people. And so the idea that a politician would have his own or her own agenda or something they're trying to do, and that we have to assess it critically, to me, this is obvious and not per se a problem. The question, of course, is how to work with these different interests. And when I started to write about this in a previous book, one of my colleagues pointed me towards an example that I didn't know well, which is the example of the US President Lyndon Johnson when he was the head of the US Senate, or the Democratic caucus of the US Senate. I'm a Canadian, and I didn't know very much about Johnson, but I read a biography of him, and even more when he was in the Senate, more than when he was president, he was really considered a brilliant politician. He was elected as head of the Democrats in the Senate because he was expected not to do anything about civil rights for Black people, and his great accomplishment is the passage of the Civil Rights Act. So it's this big, thick book. It's called Master of the Senate, and it's almost all about how he accomplished this impossible political accomplishment. And the short version is that his brilliance was he understood there are 100 members of the US Senate. He understood the agendas, the particularities, the histories of every single one of them. As it said in the book, he knew whether to reach them at home or at their mistress's house. And it was through that very precise, detailed, brutal work with everybody's different agendas that he succeeded in this political accomplishment that nobody had been able to do for 100 years. So it's a very interesting example. So the point I'm making is that the agenda and self-interest and deception of politicians and everybody else is just assumed. And the question is, how do we work with that reality?
Да, я хотела спросить у Адама, писала в комментариях, встречалась ли ему книга, которая была бы своеобразным руководством по выстраиванию коммуникации между правыми и левыми и позволяла бы приходить к консенсусу, который он мог бы порекомендовать, или, может быть, что-нибудь другое, важное, полезное, интересное, что стоило бы изучить в этих целях.
So you're looking for a self-help book, is what you're saying. I guess the only hint I would give to try to find a subject which is orthogonal, not in the center of the disagreement. So I worked once in Northern Ireland during the period of conflict in Protestants and Catholics, and the organizer of the project said, we should work on the economy. That's something that everybody wants to work on.
Yeah, Adam, thank you so much for being with us, and thank you so much for the answer about the second question about the book Communication with the Enemy, and I think I'd like to read it. So my question is about importance and power of reflection, because you know, it's what with your reflection, with the reflection of your own experience, you could create a book compatible with the classical, traditional, scientific method books. And so my question is, what kind of tools of reflection do you use? And maybe do you have some kind of specific tools or specific hints what you use with your reflection of your own experience?
I have two basic methods. We would say simple but not easy. So the first is I pay great attention to all cases of failure. In other words, a failure is when I think it's one way and I act based on my understanding and it doesn't work. And so eventually it may take me a day, it may take me a month, it may take me a year. I say, okay, so what was wrong with my understanding? So that's method number one. I think it's in this book where I quote Charles Darwin, who had a similar method where he said that he wrote down, he wrote in his notebook all disconfirming data. And that's important because most people do the opposite. They only notice and pay attention and write down to things that confirm their previous opinion. And the second one is more difficult, which is that, of course, when something difficult happens, my first reaction is always those other people were really wrong or bad or evil. And I stay with that for the first hour or day or month. But eventually I ask myself, what was my role in what happened? Because all I can affect is what I'm doing. So it is, again, a pragmatic orientation. And that is the closest I will come to a self-help comment.
Oh, awesome. Thank you.
Да, у меня один вопрос про впечатление от нашей группы, что мы, вот чем мы отличаемся от других, не знаю, англоязычных, не знаю, может быть, украинскоязычных групп и так далее. Вот.
The main comment of the Ukrainian-speaking groups is they didn't want Russian-speaking groups in the same call. That was the main message I got. My only comment, and I don't know whether it's about this group or about your methodology, Fyodor, I appreciate the seriousness of the conversation, and I realize that in ways that I am only partially aware of, there's real issues here. This isn't just a game. I appreciate the spirit of the reading of the questions of the call. So thank you. It's an honor to be with you. I really didn't expect to see so many more hearts from the Russian group than from the Los Angeles group. This is completely messing up my stereotypes.
Wonderful. Thank you, Adam. Now, is this what you want to leave us with, or if there are any
No, there is something I would like to say. And thank you all very, very much, and Fyodor and Dmitry, for your support for this work now over many years. I'm really grateful. And of course, when you write a book and you spend a long time on it, you want people to read it. So I'm in general grateful for people reading the book, but I'm particularly grateful for the seriousness in the sense of engaging with the material. I'm grateful for it. There is one thought I would like to leave you with, which is the following. I referred to it earlier. The reason I came up with the word cracks, there's a very specific reason that you may or may not have guessed, which is that I'm from Montreal and I'm obliged by citizenship to quote Leonard Cohen in every speech and every book. And I don't know if you realize that one of the most famous Leonard, I don't know if you know the singer Leonard Cohen, maybe some of you have heard of him, a Jewish Montreal singer, now deceased, quite well known in Europe. And he has a song, the song is called Anthem, and it has a very famous refrain. And in English, the refrain is, "There's a crack in everything, that's how the light gets in." So I had this in the book, but in the United States, it is absolutely impossible to include song lyrics in a book for copyright reasons. It can't be done. You'll never get permission, and you'll be sued if you don't get permission. So at the very last minute, I had to exclude this very appropriate reference from the book. So I'm repeating it to you now, but what I think is more interesting, I went back to the song and also found an interview of Leonard Cohen talking about the song. And the two lines before that are even more interesting. He says, "Ring the bells that still can ring. Forget your perfect offering. There's a crack in everything. That's how the light gets in." And what he said in his commentary, he was a bit of a mystical person. He studied Buddhism and other things. He thinks everybody has a bell they can ring, something within reach that they can do. And it may not be visible or obvious, and it may only be known to that person. But this idea that ring the bells you still can ring. But what I find more profound is forget your perfect offering. Forget the idea that the situation will be perfect, or the plan will be perfect, or the people you're working with will be perfect, or that you will be perfect. Forget it all. If you make that the precondition, if you make the offering being perfect a precondition, you will never act, or you will act much less. So I'm because I couldn't put it in the book, I wanted to share that with you.